It was a cold November night when it happened, and I can still feel the chill in my bones when I think about it. My parents had gone out for their anniversary dinner, leaving me home alone for the first time in months. I was 17, old enough to take care of myself, or so I thought. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. We lived in an old colonial-style home in a small New England town, the kind of house with character and secrets. The wind howled outside, shaking the shutters, but I wasn't scared. Not at first. Around 9 p.m., I settled into the living room with a bowl of popcorn and a horror movie playing softly on the TV. The dim light from the screen flickered across the room, casting dancing shadows on the walls. That's when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the back door. I paused the movie, straining to hear. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. My first thought was the wind, but as I approached the back door, I realized it was too precise. Too human. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. The tapping stopped abruptly as I reached for the doorknob. My fingers hovered there for a moment, but something inside me screamed not to open it. Instead, I peeked through the curtains covering the glass. No one was there, just the empty backyard lit by the pale glow of the moon. I shook it off, chalking it up to my imagination. Maybe a tree branch? But as I turned to go back to the living room, I heard it again. This time, it came from the front door. It wasn't a knock. It was the same deliberate tapping, as if someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. My chest tightened as a wave of unease washed over me. I tiptoed to the front door, my heart pounding. Through the peephole, I saw nothing but the dark outline of the porch. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. No response. I was about to call my parents when I heard it again, but this time it wasn't at a door. It was upstairs. The tapping echoed down the staircase, slow and menacing. I froze, my blood turning to ice. No one else was home. I was sure of it. Slowly, I backed away, grabbing the closest thing I could find, a fireplace poker. The tapping continued, louder now, almost as if it was daring me to investigate. I should have called 911. I know that now. But in that moment, fear clouded my judgment. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I started up the stairs. Each creak of the steps beneath my feet sounded deafening in the silence. As I reached the top, the tapping stopped. The hallway stretched out before me, shrouded in darkness. At the far end, my bedroom door was slightly ajar. "Hello?" I whispered, gripping the poker tightly. Nothing. The air felt heavier, suffocating as I approached the door. Pushing it open, I found my room exactly as I had left it, except for one thing. On the window, written in the foggy glass, was a single word: leave. I stumbled back, my breath hitching in my throat. That's when I noticed something even more horrifying. The window was locked. From the inside. Panic took over, and I bolted downstairs, my hands shaking as I grabbed my phone to call the police. Before I could dial, the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. I stood there, paralyzed, the only light coming from my phone screen. Then, from the corner of the living room, I heard it. A low, guttural laugh. I turned the flashlight on, pointing it toward the sound. The beam of light landed on the corner, but there was nothing there. Just the empty space where my dad's old armchair sat. The laugh came again, closer this time. My skin crawled as I realized it wasn't coming from one place. It was all around me, surrounding me. I ran to the front door, fumbling with the lock, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself had turned against me. Desperate, I screamed, "Leave me alone," and then silence. For a brief moment, I thought it was over. But as I turned, I saw it. Standing at the base of the stairs was a figure, barely more than a shadow. Its form was indistinct, but its eyes, two glowing orbs of white, pierced through the darkness. I don't remember much after that. The next thing I knew, I was outside, barefoot in the freezing cold, screaming for help. My neighbors found me and called my parents. When they got home, the house was exactly as we'd left it. No writing on the windows, no shadowy figure, no sign of forced entry. But I know what I saw. I moved out as soon as I turned 18, and I've never gone back. My parents still live there, insisting nothing strange has happened since that night. But every now and then, I'll get a call from my mom saying she heard tapping at the back door or found a window fogged up for no reason. I never tell her about the nightmares I still have. Nightmares of glowing eyes and a voice that whispers, "You should have left."
Story number 2.
It's been years since I've spoken about this, but the memory still haunts me. I was 16, staying home alone for the weekend while my parents went to visit my grandparents in another state. They trusted me. I was responsible, and our suburban neighborhood was as safe as they come, or so we thought. The first night passed uneventfully. I stayed up late watching TV, snacking, and texting friends. By midnight, the house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional groan of the old heating system. I went to bed without a second thought. The next night was different. It started around 10 p.m. I was scrolling through my phone in the living room when I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible scratching sound. At first, I thought it was coming from the backyard, maybe a stray animal or a branch scraping against the window. I ignored it, but it grew louder, more deliberate. I turned off the TV to listen. The scratching stopped. I convinced myself it was nothing, but the unease lingered. Around midnight, I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking everything before heading upstairs to my room. As I was brushing my teeth, I heard the sound again, this time from inside the house. It was coming from downstairs. My stomach dropped, and my heart started pounding. Gripping my phone tightly, I crept out of the bathroom, standing at the top of the stairs. The house was dark, save for the dim glow of the kitchen light I had left on. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I told myself it was probably the house settling, maybe the heating system acting up, but as I turned to go back to my room, I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "Come downstairs." I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The whisper didn't sound like it came from a person. It was raspy, almost guttural, and it sent chills down my spine. I backed into my room, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I called my best friend Jamie. She answered groggily. "Jamie, I think someone's in my house," I whispered. "Are you sure? Did you call the cops?" "I don't know. I'm scared." Before I could explain further, I heard something outside my bedroom door. Slow, deliberate footsteps, heavy enough to creak the floorboards. "Jamie, someone's outside my door," I hissed. "Get out of there. Call 911, she urged. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, staring at the door as the footsteps stopped just outside. The handle jiggled softly at first, then harder. I muted the call, clutching my phone like a lifeline. The handle stopped moving, and for a moment everything was silent. Then, from the other side of the door, I heard it again. "Come out and play." My blood ran cold. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I backed into the corner of the room, trying to make myself as small as possible. Suddenly, the door handle stopped moving, and the footsteps retreated. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, listening as the sounds faded into the distance. Finally, I mustered the courage to call the police. When they arrived, they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there. They assured me it was probably a bad dream or my imagination playing tricks on me, but I know what I heard. The next morning, as I was getting ready to leave for my friend's house, I noticed something that made my stomach churn. Written in faint, smeared letters on the bathroom mirror was a single word, play. To this day, I don't know who or what was in my house that night. I never stayed home alone again.
Story number 3.
It was supposed to be a relaxing evening. My parents had gone out to dinner, leaving me home alone for the night. I was 18, fresh out of high school, and more than capable of handling a quiet night by myself. Or so I thought. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every creak and groan of the walls. Our home was an old Victorian-style house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by woods that always seemed darker than they should be. It started around 9 p.m. I was in the kitchen making tea when I noticed it. The back door, which I was certain I had locked, was slightly ajar. A cold draft seeped in, chilling me to the bone. I frowned, shutting it tightly and locking it again. "Must have forgotten," I mumbled to myself, trying to shake off the unease. About an hour later, I was curled up on the couch watching a movie when I heard it. A faint knock. Not on the front door, but on the window. I froze, my eyes darting to the living room window. The curtains were drawn, but the knock came again, louder this time. Slowly, I got up and peeked through the curtains. The yard was empty, bathed in the pale light of the moon. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, but there was no one there. I locked the windows and tried to convince myself it was just the wind. But deep down, I knew better. At around 11 p.m., things took a darker turn. I was upstairs in my room, scrolling through my phone when I heard it again. A knock, this time on my bedroom door. "Mom? Dad?" I called out, even though I knew they weren't home. No answer. The knock came again, louder, more insistent. My heart raced as I approached the door. "Who's there?" I demanded. my voice shaking. Still no answer. Gripping the doorknob, I flung the door open, expecting to find someone or something on the other side. But the hallway was empty. I stepped out, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. The house felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. That's when I saw it. At the end of the hallway, near the attic door, stood a figure. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and cloaked in shadow. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if it was studying me. I couldn't see its face, only the glint of two reflective eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure raised a long, bony finger and pointed toward the attic. The gesture was slow, deliberate. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, pointing, as if daring me to go up. I backed into my room, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands trembled as I called 911. "There's someone in my house," I stammered to the dispatcher. They assured me officers were on their way, but as I waited, the knocking started again. This time, it was coming from inside the room. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. On the far wall, just above my desk, were 3 deep, jagged scratches, fresh and dripping with something dark. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, as if it was coming from all around me. The walls seemed to pulse with the sound, closing in. When the police arrived, the house was empty. No figure, no scratches, no signs of forced entry. But I know what I saw, what I heard. For weeks after that night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind felt like a whisper in my ear. And sometimes in the dead of night, I'd hear faint knocking coming from the attic. I moved out as soon as I could. My parents still live there, but they refuse to talk about the strange things they've started experiencing. Scratches on the walls, shadowy figures in the corners of their eyes. I don't visit anymore. I can't. Because I know it's still there, waiting.
Story number 4.
I'll never forget the night it happened. I was 19 and staying in my childhood home for the weekend while my parents were out of town. It had been a while since I'd been back, and something about the house felt different. It wasn't just the creaks and groans of an old structure. It was the air. Thick, heavy, almost suffocating. It started just after 10 p.m. I was in the living room, flipping through channels when the power went out. Everything plunged into darkness, except for the faint glow of my phone. I sighed, figuring it was just a blown fuse, but when I looked out the window, I noticed the streetlights were still on. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, like a whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was too deliberate, too clear. It came from the hallway, just outside the living room. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The whispering stopped. I grabbed my flashlight and stood, my pulse racing. The beam of light illuminated the hallway, revealing nothing but empty shadows. I told myself it was my imagination. That's what you do in situations like this, isn't it? Rationalize. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I decided to check the circuit breaker in the basement. Big mistake. The stairs creaked beneath my feet as I descended into the dark, musty space. The flashlight barely cut through the blackness, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. As I reached the bottom, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The breaker box was open, wires spilling out as if it had been ripped apart. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Someone had been here. Maybe they still were. As I backed up, the whispering started again. Louder this time, and closer. It wasn't just one voice. It was many, overlapping, rising and falling in a sinister rhythm. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I spun around, shining the flashlight wildly. The beam landed on the far corner of the basement, and my blood turned to ice. There was something there. At first, I thought it was a person, crouched in the shadows. But as the light hit it, I realized it wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending in ways that made my skin crawl. Its face, or what passed for a face, was a pale, featureless void. And then it moved. It unfolded itself, rising to its full height, its head nearly grazing the ceiling. The whispering grew deafening, filling the room like a physical force. I didn't think. I just ran. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. My hands shook as I locked it, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't help. Whatever that thing was, locks wouldn't stop it. The house was dead silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I backed into the living room, clutching my phone like a lifeline. That's when I saw it again. It was standing in the corner of the room, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. How it got there, I don't know. I didn't hear it move, didn't see it follow me. It was just there. and then it spoke. "Why are you here?" Its voice was a horrible mix of whispers and guttural tones, like dozens of voices speaking at once. I couldn't answer. My throat felt like it had closed up. The thing took a step forward, its long limbs moving with an almost insect-like precision. "You don't belong," it hissed. I backed away, fumbling for the front door. My fingers found the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, until it felt like it was inside my head. Suddenly, the thing lunged. I don't remember much after that. I woke up on the porch, gasping for air, the morning sun just beginning to rise. The door behind me was locked, and the house was silent. My parents didn't believe me when I told them. They laughed it off, said I'd had a bad dream. But I know what I saw. A week later, they sold the house. My mom said she couldn't sleep there anymore, that she kept hearing strange noises at night. We don't talk about it now, but sometimes when I close my eyes, I see it. Standing in the corner, watching, waiting.
Story number 5.
It was the summer after my freshman year of college, and my parents had left me home alone for the weekend. They were visiting my aunt a few hours away, and I had decided to stay back to catch up on some schoolwork. The house felt emptier than usual, even though it was familiar, almost comforting during the day. But that night, things changed. I was sitting in the dining room, headphones on, working on my laptop. It was around 11 p.m., and the neighborhood was dead quiet. I remember glancing at the clock and deciding I'd finish one more section of my paper before calling it a night. That's when I heard it, a faint knock. It wasn't at the front door. It was coming from the sliding glass door in the kitchen. My stomach tightened. Nobody used that door. It opened to our backyard, which was fenced in and completely dark. My first instinct was to ignore it, but the knock came again, louder this time. I slipped off my headphones, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. No answer. I grabbed a kitchen knife and crept toward the sliding door. My reflection in the glass stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed, but there was nothing else. I flicked on the backyard light. The empty yard stared back at me. I locked the door, double-checking it before retreating to the living room. I told myself it was probably just a stray animal or maybe even my imagination. But deep down, I knew better. Around midnight, I decided to head upstairs to bed. I left the downstairs lights on, feeling too uneasy to plunge the house into total darkness. As I climbed the stairs, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't a knock. It was the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from the second floor. I froze mid-step, every muscle in my body screaming to run. "Is someone there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. No response. I forced myself to continue up the stairs, gripping the knife tightly. The hallway was empty, but the air felt wrong, thicker, heavier, as if something unseen was pressing down on me. I checked every room, every closet, every shadowed corner. Nothing. By the time I finished, I felt foolish. I must have been imagining things. Exhausted, I locked my bedroom door, climbed into bed, and tried to sleep. That's when I heard the whisper. It was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the rustle of leaves outside, but it grew louder, closer. "Let me in." My eyes snapped open. The voice was coming from just outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, paralyzed with fear, as the whispering continued. "Let me in, please." It sounded almost pleading, but there was something wrong about it, something inhuman. I grabbed my phone and called 911, whispering my address to the operator. They assured me officers were on their way, but the voice didn't stop. It began to rattle the doorknob, the whispers turning into a low growl. Then it stopped. The silence was worse. I strained to hear, but the house was deathly quiet. When the police arrived, they found no signs of forced entry. They told me it was likely a prank or my imagination, but I could see the unease in their eyes. The next morning, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Scratched into the outside of my bedroom door, in jagged, uneven letters, was a single word: soon. I moved out a week later and never looked back, but every so often, late at night, I swear I hear it again, a faint knock, a whisper. "Let me in."
Story number 6.
It happened during my sophomore year of high school. My parents had gone to a wedding out of town, leaving me alone for the night. They joked about how I'd finally have a chance to prove I wasn't afraid of the house by myself. At the time, I laughed along, not realizing what was about to unfold. Our house was old, built in the early 1900s, and had always had its quirks: creaking floors, drafty windows, and the occasional, unexplained noise. I'd grown up in it, so I was used to its peculiarities. But that night, the house felt different. Around 9 p.m., I settled on the couch with a bowl of popcorn and a horror movie. Ironically, I thought it would be fun to scare myself a little. The movie was halfway through when I heard it, a faint tapping sound. It wasn't loud, but it was consistent, coming from somewhere upstairs. I paused the movie, holding my breath to listen. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, less like someone drumming their fingers on a wall. Probably the pipes, I muttered, though my voice didn't sound convincing even to me. I tried to ignore it, turning the volume up on the movie. But then, I heard another sound, a soft, shuffling noise, as if someone was walking across the floor above me. My heart began to race. I grabbed my phone and texted my best friend, "I think I'm hearing stuff in the house." Her reply came quickly, "Probably just the wind. Relax." I wanted to believe her, but deep down I knew the house wasn't just settling. Someone, or something, was moving upstairs. Determined to prove to myself that I was just being paranoid, I grabbed a flashlight and headed up the creaky staircase. Each step felt heavier, the air colder as I climbed. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. At the top of the stairs, I noticed the door to the guest bedroom was slightly ajar. I could have sworn I had closed it earlier. My flashlight beam quivered as I reached for the door handle and pushed it open. The room was empty, but as I stepped inside, the flashlight caught something on the far wall. 3 deep scratches gouged into the wood. Fresh. They hadn't been there before. My stomach churned, and I backed out of the room, slamming the door shut. As I turned to go back downstairs, the shuffling sound started again, this time coming from the attic. I stared at the attic door, a pull-down hatch in the hallway ceiling. The string to open it swayed gently as if someone had just tugged it. I froze, debating whether to run or investigate. Before I could decide, the string jerked upward violently, slamming the attic door shut with a loud bang. That was enough for me. I bolted downstairs, locking myself in the living room with every light on. I called my parents, leaving a shaky voicemail about what had happened. They called back almost immediately. "Stay out of the attic," my dad said, his voice unusually stern. "We'll talk about this when we get home." That's when I remembered something my mom had mentioned years ago, in passing. The attic was where the previous owner had been found. She didn't like to talk about it, but I knew the basics. A man who had lived there alone for decades, found dead in that very attic under unusual circumstances. I didn't sleep that night. When my parents returned the next day, they didn't dismiss my story. Instead, my dad went into the attic and came back pale-faced, refusing to tell me what he found. We moved out 6 months later. To this day, I don't know what was in that attic, and I don't want to. But sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I hear the faint sound of tapping, just like that night, and I wonder if it ever really left.
Story number 7.
When I was 17, my family moved into an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. It was a sprawling property, surrounded by overgrown fields and dense woods. The house had been vacant for years, and while my parents saw it as a fixer-upper with charm, I always felt an undercurrent of unease. It started small, little things that were easy to dismiss. Lights flickering, doors creaking open on their own, and strange cold spots that seemed to follow me from room to room. My parents brushed it off as quirks of an old house, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, especially at night. One evening, my parents went to visit family, leaving me alone in the house. I wasn't thrilled, but I figured I'd just stay in my room with my headphones on and try to ignore the creeping anxiety. Around 9 p.m., I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone when I heard it. A faint knock, coming from the front door. I paused, holding my breath. The knock came again, louder this time. I crept to the window that overlooked the front porch. The motion sensor light was on, but there was no one there. Probably just a prank, I told myself, trying to ignore the way my hands were shaking. I went downstairs to check, making sure the door was locked. It was. But as I turned to head back upstairs, I heard another knock, this time from the back door. Every hair on my body stood on end. The back door was in the kitchen, facing the woods. I peeked around the corner, my heart pounding, and saw the kitchen light flicker. The door was still locked, but the knocking persisted. I called out, "Who's there?" trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the door. The knocking stopped. For a moment, everything was silent, and then from behind me I heard a soft, raspy whisper. "Upstairs." I froze. The voice was faint, but it came from inside the house. I turned, my flashlight beam sweeping the room, but it was empty. Terrified, I ran upstairs to my room, slamming the door and locking it. My heart was racing as I grabbed my phone and called my parents, but the call wouldn't go through. The signal was gone and my Wi-Fi had stopped working. That's when I noticed it. Scratched into the wood of my bedroom door, as if by fingernails, were the words, "Why are you here?" I wanted to scream, but fear choked the sound in my throat. My instinct told me to leave, but I was too scared to step out of the room. Instead, I pushed my dresser in front of the door and sat in the corner, clutching my phone like a lifeline. Hours passed. The house was silent, but the silence was oppressive, suffocating. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to the sound of creaking floorboards just outside my door. Something was there. I could feel it. The doorknob rattled, then turned, but the dresser held it shut. Whatever was outside let out a long, guttural growl, a sound that didn't belong to anything human. I stayed frozen in that corner until the first light of dawn seeped through the curtains. When I finally worked up the courage to move the dresser and open the door, the hallway was empty. But at the end of the hall, leading to the attic, the door was wide open. We moved out a month later. My parents never admitted to experiencing anything, but I saw the way my mom flinched whenever the lights flickered, or the way my dad avoided the attic entirely. I'll never go back to that house. And even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I can still hear that whisper, "Upstairs."